listening to Give God 90, where we're not afraid of the tough biblical questions, because we will dig through the language, the culture, and the history to find the truth revealed in the words of our Creator.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for spending some time with us today. I am being carefully supervised this evening.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
You might be glad you spent some time with us this time, because if you're not careful, you might just learn something. Hopefully you learn something every time, but especially tonight. If you're new here, thank you for joining. Don't forget, the GiveGod90.com's out there for your convenience and hopefully your use, so it's there. It's not very often that I get to say this at a time when some people think it's happening. So depending on which calendar you're following, Happy Hanukkah.
Yes, Happy Hanukkah, everyone.
Or if you're on a different calendar, it'll be in 2 days. It's just one of those weird calendar things that happens every once in a while. So whenever, whatever, Happy Hanukkah. And of course, this year, Hanukkah begins at sundown, depending on where you are in the world and which calendar you're following. So depending on where you are and when you're listening, it could have already started, which is fine. Or it could be in a couple of days, which is fine. It all depends. You do the best you can with what you have to work with, right?
Exactly.
So, whatever you, and let's face it, Hanukkah is one of those things that is not found in Leviticus 23. So we have some grace and some leeway there. So just saying. More on that later. The weird thing is, as many Messianic folks and many Jewish believers are celebrating Hanukkah this week at some point in time. Christians are getting ready for Christmas. And believe it or not, everybody, and when I say everybody, I mean everybody, gets distracted. And we get distracted by traditions. Christians get distracted by Christmas trees and lights and all the trappings that go with Christmas. People that celebrate Hanukkah get distracted by the lights and the Hanukkah and all the trappings that go with it.
Sofganiyot.
No, that's not a distraction. That's just plain good. If you don't know what Sofganiyot is, it's like a jelly donut. Okay, with lots of sugar. Mm-hmm. Lots and lots of sugar. Oh, I gain weight just saying that. So we become distracted from the miracles that surround this time of year. And with Hanukkah, we're distracted from the many, many miracles that led to the defeat of the Greek army. So let's have a short history lesson. There won't be a test later, all right? But just so you know what led up to it. Now, after the Persian king Cyrus allowed the Jewish people to return, it basically ended the Babylonian exile. And Israel experienced a couple of 100 years of independence. They were kind of left alone for a little while. And it was basically a theocracy. It was governed by the increasingly powerful priests, often called the quiet years at this time, because there seemed not to be a prophet between the time of Malachi and the birth of Yeshua, the birth of Jesus. the people appeared to be doing things kind of on their own. However, there were some righteous people out there, some prophets, but the priests failed to allow any to be officially heard, nothing to be officially written. And they may have been mad at God for allowing the exile, or they might have just thought that, well, we can handle this on our own. We can do things our way. That never goes well, by the way. During this time, though, the divide between the average worker and the rich was widening. It was getting bigger and bigger. Poor farmers had to sell land to the rich landowners, but instead of the debt being canceled according to Torah, the landowners would often try to cheat the farmers by offering them more land or different land in a very out-of-the-way place. Sometimes they didn't even own it. Not much different than things are today in different parts of the world. Now, other workers, they didn't fare much better. If you didn't live close to Jerusalem, and if you didn't work directly for one of the Pharisees or one of the Sadducees, because the priesthood was in such a disarray, they weren't often Levites. They weren't always Levites after this time. You probably had a pretty tough life. And the funny thing is that after the exiles, the priests no longer tolerated their typical servant lifestyles. They were kind of hungry for power. Like I said, they were no longer specifically from the tribe of Levi. They had all kinds. They accepted all of the tribes in there. Remember, Paul was from the tribe of Benjamin. And during this time, around 175 BC, Antiochus, however you want to pronounce it, both depending on where you're from, could be correct, or neither one might be correct. Antiochus IV, known as Epiphanes, took the throne over the Seleucid Empire in the north. And he was a little greedy for power, too. He was kind of power hungry. He was one of these kind of folks who, history tells us, enjoyed ruling. Let's just put it that way. He was kind of the dictator of the day. Let's put it that way. But meanwhile, back in Israel, there was a faction of priests who bribed their way to the top, so to speak. And this is all written in history. In fact, as they were bribing their way to the top, of course, Antiochus was more than happy to take their money. And he didn't care. He didn't care who was doing what as long as he was getting his. He was he would have made a really good modern day politician in the United States. I don't care what happens as long as I get mine. That kind of goes for politicians around the world, I think. One priest named Jason, he only served 3 years because somebody else decided that, when I've got enough money, I can buy the high priest position. Now, Millennius was not from the Levites, and that upset a lot of the working class Judeans. And Millennius actually used the temple treasury to pay Antiochus, and he tried to Hellenize the Jews by, basically turning them into Greeks. So what happened is you basically have a Greek-occupied Israel run by a puppet high priest. He was bought and paid for by the temple treasury. Now, this is where things get interesting. We see the Hasmoneans, the poor people of Israel. Millennius put a statue of Zeus in the Holy of Holies and ordered a pig to be sacrificed on the altar in the temple. By the way, this is the short version, okay? This takes up 1st and 2nd Maccabees, what I'm going through very quickly here. And when you order an unclean animal to be sacrificed on the altar in the temple, it was just more than some folks could stand. And that was a defining moment for Mattathias of Modin, who refused to comply. And another Jewish person stepped forward and said, well, I'll do it. I'll sacrifice the pig. I like my life. Mattathias killed him. So apparently he didn't like his life that much. And after Mattathias of Modin, Mattathias Maccabee, killed the priest, he basically went through the countryside saying, everyone who is for the covenant and for the law, follow me. He made a declaration. This was his declaration of war, and many consider that to be the beginning of the revolt. Now, Judas, known as Maccabee, was one of Mattathias' 5 sons. He actually proved to be a very, very good leader. And throughout the books of the Maccabees, Judas consistently reminds everyone of the law and his intention to do things the Creator's way. I'm not doing this for me. I'm not, and he never claimed to be a prophet. Nobody ever called him that. He just simply said, you know what? We need to do this God's way. This has to be done. If we're going to continue to live here, we have to do things the way our Creator designed us to do them. That was his battle cry. And before every battle, the entire army would lay face down on the ground and pray for guidance. Israel, are you listening to me now? Before every battle, they would lay face down on the ground and pray for guidance. And often, I should say, their prayers would seem to read, well, we don't know what's going to happen, but if you want us to win, it's not going to be because we did it, it's going to be because you did it. That was their prayer. We don't know what's going to happen, but if you choose for us to win, it's not going to be because of anything we did. It's all on you. And that small group of dedicated men followed the Creator's instructions as best as they could to allow him to perform his miracles. And when they did, it led to victory. And it's often been described as a rebellion for independence. But it was really, if we think about it, a war of dependence, not independence. They wanted to be dependent only on the Creator. Well, finally, after a couple of years, Judas and the rebels defeated the mighty Greek army. Well, that's not really correct. After a couple of years, our Creator defeated the mighty Greek army. Okay? Let's put it in some real perspective here. It wasn't anything, well, they might have laid the groundwork. They were the foot soldiers. The general, the leader, was the Almighty himself. and they were able to enter Jerusalem in victory. Isn't that amazing? Once they entered the temple, it was in shambles. Weeds were growing. Everything was in disarray. And the first thing they did was to clean it up. And this story is not found in most Bibles today. It was removed along with the rest of the Apocrypha late in the 19th century by the American British Bible Society. They decided that Bibles were very expensive to print, and nobody was reading these books anyway. Well, some of us are. But guess what? They're still in some Bibles today, and they're still available in small books called the Apocrypha. The story of Hanukkah can be found in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And that's the really the short version of it. It took me 15 minutes to get through the short version. Aren't you glad I didn't choose to give you the long version? Myra's sitting here shaking her head. Yeah, I'm glad you did. Now, a short version from 2nd Maccabees, if you want to read that passage.
And when they had done this, they fell prostrate and besought the Lord that they might never again fall into such misfortune, but that if they should ever sin, they might be disciplined by him with forbearance and not be handed over to the blasphemous and barbarous nations. It happened that on that same day on which the sanctuary had been profaned by the foreigners, the purification of the sanctuary took place, that is, on the 25th day of the same month, which is Kislev. And they celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing, in the manner of the Feast of Booths, remembering how long before, during the Feast of Booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. Therefore, bearing ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches, and also fronds of palm, they offered hymns of thanksgiving to him who had given success to the purifying of his own holy place. They decreed by public ordinance and vote that the whole nation of the Jews should observe these days every year. Such then was the end of Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes. 2nd Maccabees 10, 4-9.
Now, if you notice very carefully, very critical listeners will hear no mention of a container of oil that lasted for 8 days. Isn't that strange? You see, the very first mention of any miracle of oil isn't until about 700 years later in the 5th century. It's actually in the Babylonian Talmud, source number 3. 700 years later is when the tradition of the oil lasting for 8 days was written down. Now, we don't know for certain that when that started. We just know when it was written down. But what we do know for certain is that not only is Hanukkah a feast of dedication or rededication of the temple, but it's important to realize that when we read history or the battles that led to the victory, these men were following the Creator's instructions. And every time they took no glory or honor for themselves. You see, they didn't follow the ways of the corrupt priesthood that got them into the mess they were in. They didn't follow their own desires. They chose to follow the Creator's way because they knew it was the only way that they could win. These men were dedicated to the Creator. Hanukkah means dedication. Not only the rededication of the temple, but the people who were dedicated to the Almighty. And it's not very often that we use Josephus, but it's important here because it gives us a great deal of information in a very, very short summary. And if you'd like to read that part out of Josephus.
The generals of Antiochus' armies, having been defeated so often, Judah Maccabee assembled the people and told them that after many victories which God had given them, they ought to go up to Jerusalem and purify the temple and offer the appointed sacrifices. But when he, with the whole multitude, came to Jerusalem and found the temple deserted, its gates burned down and plants growing in the temple of their own accord because of the desolation, he and those with him began to lament in their distress at the sight of the temple. So he chose some of his soldiers and gave them the order to fight the men that guarded the upper city until he had purified the temple. When therefore he had carefully purged it, he brought in new vessels, the menorah, the table, the incense altar, which were made of gold, and hung up the veils at the doors, and restored the doors themselves. He also took down the altar and built a new one of stones that he had gathered together, and such as not been hewn with iron tools. And on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, which the Macedonians call Apilios,
That sounds right.
they lighted the lights that were on the menorah and offered incense upon the altar, and laid the loaves upon the table, and offered burnt offerings upon the new altar. As it happened, these things took place on the very same day on which 3 years before the divine worship had been reduced to an impure and profane form of worship. For the temple had remained desolate for 3 years after being made so by Antiochus. And the desolation of the temple came about in accordance with the prophecy of Daniel, which had been made 408 years before, for he had revealed that the Macedonians would destroy it. And so Judah and his fellow citizens celebrated the festival of restoration of the sacrifices of the temple for 8 days, and omitted no sort of pleasure, but every one feasted upon every rich and splendid sacrifices. And they honored God, and delighted themselves with the psalms of praise and the playing of harps. Indeed, they were so very glad at the revival of their custom. And after so long a time, having unexpectedly regained their right to worship, and they made it a law for their posterity that they should keep a festival celebrating the restoration of their temple worship for 8 days. And from that time to this, we celebrate this, which we call the Festival of Lights, because, I imagine, beyond our hopes, this rite was brought to light, and so this name was placed on the festival.
So that, of course, comes from in Josephus, Antiquity of the Jews, that can be found in Book 12, if you're keeping score. A whole lot of information in a very short summary. Now, I'd love to go into this, but I won't. But what I will say is that most Christians fail to realize that other than Passover, the book of John records more events during Hanukkah than any of the other feasts. And I said Hanukkah can't be found in Leviticus chapter 23 because it wasn't there. It's not a direct order from the Almighty. It's not one of his feasts. But because of all the miracles that led up to it that were not possible without the Creator, they chose to celebrate that victory. And they based that celebration on the great Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. It lasts, it's a 7-day feast that lasts 8 days because you have to include the last great day, right? I mean, that's...
It's just how it is.
That's just how it is. And Christians, I'm going to say this. If you want to follow the example of Yeshua, if you want to follow the example of Jesus, you might want to include celebrating Hanukkah this time of year. You see, without the defeat of the Greek army, we would have a very, very different history. We would have a very, very different series of events than what we have today. So Hanukkah is a celebration of miracles, many, many miracles. And I would encourage you to find and read. It's available in books. It's available online. First and Second Maccabees. It's enlightening for a lot of reasons. Now, I will say this about the book of Maccabees. To my knowledge, no Hebrew text of that exists. The only thing we have is in the original Greek, and of course it's translated into English, so people who read English can read it. But it's one of the reasons that a lot of the Jewish people today don't put a lot of credit, or as much credit as they should, in those miracles. But as you read in Josephus, who was a historian, and even the secular world recognizes Josephus as a great historian for some strange reason, even though he bases all of his history on the Bible, what we see in his account is far more information than most people would even think about. No mention of the oil lasting for 8 days. That was not written down until 700 years later for some strange reason. There is an interesting passage in John, I believe it's in chapter 10, that says that Jesus went to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Dedication. So, yes, Christians, if you're going to follow Jesus, maybe you need to follow him there too and learn some history about Hanukkah, because it is much more than just lighting the menorah, the Hanukkah. It's not a true menorah. It's different. But at the same time, think about everything that they did to defeat the army. Who did they follow? They didn't do it their way. And if you read those accounts, that little ragtag bunch of fighters should have been defeated long time ago. But they were able, simply by doing nothing more than following the Creator's instructions, to defeat the mighty Greek army, which was the strongest army in the known world at that time. Well, China might have had a bigger one, but they had their own problems. What I'm getting at, I believe this is found in Scripture too. Nothing is impossible with God. Does that sound familiar?
It does.
Yeah, this is the season for miracles. This is the season when good things can happen. Don't be left out. You really want to see a lot of miracles take place? Read First and Second Maccabees, because they're there. And they're not hiding. They're right there in plain sight. So, until Monday.
Until Monday. Happy Hanukkah, everyone.
Happy Hanukkah. Many, many blessings, everyone.